If everyone could just move forward, that'd be great. So more people who are coming late can sit behind you guys. If everyone could just scoot forward a little bit.
Last time Maharaj was here, it's a little different. The weather was a little different. So welcome you all to tonight's program. And as you see tonight, for those of you who's here for the first time, okay. So some regulars, some first time people. You see tonight's format's a little different. So usually our Bhakti night format is more traditional. Speaker makes a presentation. And but if we look at the text, spiritual text, specifically in our tradition, you'll see that oftentimes these texts are in the form of a dialogue. Two people speaking. Usually there's one person who is somehow in a difficult situation, cannot understand what's happening. And then there is a sage who is there to explain to him or help him understand something. So because Maharaj was here to embody the sage, and I'm here to embody the person who doesn't really know what's happening. We thought that it would be good to have a little bit of a discussion tonight. And the topic for discussion is the relationship between humanity and spirituality. So humanity is, in the world that we live in, we see that increasingly people are experiencing a life that is more artificial, and also a world that is for a large part getting much harsher. And basically, oftentimes people feel like just to be some of their basic human needs, human relationships, that the world is sometimes making it more difficult. So it's a very relevant topic. And I decided to talk, actually I decided that talking to Mark was very gracious. He was going to speak on whatever we were hoping for. And I always found his presentation of spirituality one that has a human element to it. So I think before we start off, so it's sort of just a general introduction to what we will be looking at tonight and discussing this relationship between humanity and spirituality. And to start off the discussion, I would like to ask you, Marsh, tell us a little bit about your background, and then specifically, I think the opening position, that's something that we can think about, is how renunciation or renounced life, which you have dedicated yourself to, which is an interesting part. No, you don't need the mic. Just I don't think it's really going to work though. But if it looks good in the video, then we'll
Or you can speak a little louder.
I'll speak a little louder. Yeah, those mics on the video. So, a little bit about your journey, and specifically how you came to this point of making lifelong vows of renunciation, which I think can segue us into discussion on humanity and spirituality.
Thank you so much, Hari-Vilasa. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. Yeah, looking forward to having a discussion and seeing what comes out of this exchange. My journey, I guess, the ancient scriptures talk about how when we begin our journey of spiritual life, in this life, it's not actually the beginning. There were many lives previous in which we already perhaps had many experiences and, came across many things. And in this life, we're just kind of picking up from where we left off. So I don't know who I was in my previous life. I tried to do a past life regression. But somehow I didn't have the patience. But I could see from my childhood that there were definitely things within me which perhaps didn't really go in sync with the world that I was living in. I was living in a world in which everything was about accumulation, I guess I grew up in quite an affluent family, but my tendency was always towards like simplicity and minimalism. I grew up in a family in which everyone was a high achiever, and for me that didn't really move my heart. I grew up in a family where there was a lot of tradition and culture which I respected, but for me didn't really also grab my interest, because I was kind of thinking it was a little superficial. And so I found myself in my youth a bit introverted, a little bit different from the world. And then I was thinking, what am I going to do? I have to do something with my life. I have to find something that's going to inspire me. And so I guess at the age of 15, 16, I began looking into different spiritual books, different spiritual traditions. Of course, I came across the Bhagavad Gita at that time. And it kind of fascinated me because it was pretty counterintuitive. For those of you that have read the Bhagavad Gita, you know that it's a conversation between Arjuna and Krishna. And when you begin that conversation reading it and you hear all of Arjuna's arguments, you think like, wow, this guy's the one with the wisdom. And then you later on find out he's the confused guy. And Krishna's the one with the wisdom. And immediately it kind of flipped my understanding, because my traditional idea of what spirituality was challenged by the Bhagavad Gita. Anyway, so then I continued reading that, went to university, and after graduating I decided I still hadn't found what was moving my heart. So I guess at that time I just took some time to disconnect, and I went to India for 6 months at the age of 21. And that was a really transformational time, because I felt like it was the first time in life that I was away from all of the noises, the opinions, the narratives, the pressures, the traditions that I realized at the age of 21 had drowned out what my inner calling was. Therefore, I still to this day recommend everyone do that. Spend some time away from your normal habitat, because you might find it reveals something in your heart that you never otherwise heard. And so, yeah, I lived as a monk there for 6 months, and then found my calling there. And then I came back to London, became a monk, and I guess what to say, just carried on. And still learning, still growing, still discovering. And last year I took vows of lifelong renunciation, which I guess is a landmark in someone's life. But I'll just end on this point of humanity and transcendence. The day I took vows of lifelong renunciation, I thought there may be a magical change when I woke up the next morning. And many people ask me, how was it? And I tell them, on that night, everything changed and nothing changed. Everything changed in the sense it was a new life, a new role, a new social identity in one sense. But nothing changed in the sense that I realized I still have my human weaknesses. I'm still a normal person. I'm still beyond all of those names, just a soul trying to find love, trying to find pure consciousness. And so, yeah, that was a stark realization.
Yeah, I find it interesting how you say that. If we think about when people would say, spirituality in the human face, when we are looking for, what is the opposite of someone who is human or humane, is harshness or a certain sense of denial, some of our basic desires, for example. And I find it interesting if we look at vows of renunciation, for example, which is called, in Sanskrit, called the Brihat Vrata, which is the great vow. It's also can sometimes be called the terrible vow. You see that in in literature sometimes it's described like that. And I find it interesting this tradition how, on the one hand, what is more normal, we could say, what is a more humane desire, being human, than the desire to say have a family and have quote unquote a normal life. And in the name of spirituality or transcendence, ultimately makes that decision to deny that. How do we understand that? How does these ideals of spirituality seem to contrast so strongly against the basic human needs that we have? And how did you make use of that in your own life? And how do you see that being relevant then for the rest of the world in terms of normal, quote-unquote, normal humans? And how do they orientate themselves towards the example of renunciation and set-free by Marx or Marx?
Yeah. Yeah, it seems the most natural of things to be attracted to the opposite gender, to then form relationships, to have a family, and to exchange love and feelings in that way. And isn't it a little bit inhumane to walk away from that and deny the most innate of human intuition, as it were? I guess the first thing I'd say is this: renunciation, I think, is something that all of us do. Renunciation, or some level of what we call austerity, is the idea whereby you deny an immediate passion that you have in pursuance of something much greater. And so we often tell people, don't give up what you want most or what feels good now. And we all know that that's a good thing. And therefore, I think all of us are renounced in some way, because we learn to give up things that we feel are not beneficial for us at this time in pursuance of something higher. So I think renunciation is not an unknown concept. It's a concept which everyone applies in their life to a greater or lesser extent. Now, when it comes to relationships and the sexual urge, what the ancient scriptures explain is that attraction between man and woman is actually the principle on which the whole world is going on. In one of our literatures it says that sex is the backdrop of civilization, because it's like that's basically what everything in the material world ultimately is aiming towards. And so this idea of how to transcend this sexual desire and find the pure form of love is actually the essence of spirituality. In one sentence we could say spirituality means the process of turning lust into love. And if one is able to do that, then their spirituality is perfected. And to the extent that we struggle with that, we realize we have work to do. So now in that process of transforming lust into love, different people may do it in different ways. Some people will do it by a complete renunciation of any kind of contact and engage their energies elsewhere to then transcend. And that comes naturally to them. And for other people, they'll engage in relationships, but in a very, very specific and spiritual way. And thereby, in our tradition, many people do get married. Most people do get married, and they have relationships. And then they, through that purity of that relationship, learn to transform the lust into love. And so both paths are considered valid, and both paths are considered as powerful as each other. But because we're all different, and because we all kind of just approach life differently, there are alternatives. Like, are you the person who, when there's a cold swimming pool, goes in and kind of dips in like the right toe, and then dips in the left toe, and then kind of goes in slowly? Or are you the person who just goes, okay, let's jump in? So we both approach the swimming pool in a different way according to our nature, but ultimately we get immersed. So different people will embrace that spiritual path in a different way, according to what's natural.
Yeah, I appreciate that point though. That what you are representing, or renunciation, it's a universal concept. It's not just that there's some people who are renounced, others who are not. And even if we think of something like marriage, in essence, it is also about renunciation. If you get married, it means you renounce every single other person on the planet, and now one's committed is to one person. So it's interesting how commitment and renunciation are actually totally connected, and no one can commit to anything without some form of renunciation. I think that's important because, for myself, growing up in a Protestant society, for example, never got exposed to monks at all. I've never seen a monk in my life until whatever, I was in my 19 at the first experience. So it was an interesting experience of engaging with that and sort of trying to understand what it represents, and then how it's also relevant for myself. So I appreciate that point of showing that renunciation is something universal, and it's part of the human, it's actually part of the human experience. And but I think if one enters into a spiritual tradition that has such high ideals, that it is then that we also encounter another kind of tension between transcendence and humanity, which is the experience of having that pressure. Speaking about turning lust into love, and that is a high, lofty goal. And when it starts to really speak about love, especially in like a transcendent sense. And I've seen through my own experiences in life, in a spiritual tradition, through my own practices, or like with other people, the intense pressure and tension that can be created in the individual when he is exposed to high ideals. And we see that now in society, for example, there's like a big camp of people that would say, in the name, for example, of humanity, that ideals or pressure is the thing that causes unhappiness. And yet in our tradition, that's really something we hold high. And the reality is that the majority of people actually fall short of the ideal. And we've seen in our own life, seen to other people, that when we fall short of our ideals, that is a painful experience. An experience that can actually sometimes cause a lot of difficulty, feeling judged either by yourself or by society. How did you deal with that, and what is your experiences with digesting high ideals in your own personal life, and also in people that you're guiding to their own spiritual?
Yeah, it's a problem for many people. There's an ideal of where we want to be. There's a standard of purity. There's a goal, and there's the reality of where we are, and the reality of our own weakness when we wake up every day and we face our own weakness. And then this gap can cause a lot of frustration, can cause a lot of guilt, and can cause a lot of sometimes hopelessness, and even in acute sense, a lot of depression sometimes. It just overcomes people. Well, my experience was this. When a child is growing up, generally, the best situation is that a mother and a father is present. And of course, there may be some variation, but generally, the father is giving discipline. The father is setting high visions of what the child can and should be. The father is all about achievement and bringing out the best of the child. And then the mother gives a lot of love, gives a lot of nurturing, gives a lot of just encouragement in the here and now. And in that way, what happens is you're striving for something high, but you simultaneously have the love and the acceptance and the encouragement that keeps you going now and helps you to move towards that ideal. Oftentimes what I find in spiritual communities is that there's a lot of the ideals, but maybe there's not enough of the love, the community, the camaraderie, the acceptance, the reality amongst each other to talk about the struggles and help each other. And what I would say is where you have that community and you have the high ideals, then that combination allows people to achieve their potential. Sometimes what people do is they say, no, these ideals create too much guilt, so we should just take the ideals out. But rather what I say is keep the ideals, but give a lot of love, give a lot of support. Let's help each other to realize that yes, we do have struggles, but we can make it. And when you have that kind of community which supports the ideals, then the guilt and the sense of lacking doesn't overcome you and drown you, but you learn to grow from that and be what you can and should be. So I think if you take the ideals out, then you shortchange people of the potentiality of what they can and should be. And at the same time, if you take the love and the community out, then you give people a vision, but you don't help them to walk there. So I would say we need both things. And that's why we need a spiritual movement in which there's community and a lot of realness between us to be able to say, yeah, that's what it says in the books, but this is where I am. But how can we walk there?
What about those who don't have that? I mean, we speak about spiritual community, and I think we all acknowledge the need for that, but it is difficult to find, actually. The majority of people in the world today are lonely. I think recently, it was the mayor, Eric Adams, I think I get some newsletter from the mayor's office, and he said something that, there's an epidemic of loneliness in New York City. We'll go to some statistics. And the reality is, so again, like that ideal example is there when one does have that support. And we can see that it really makes a difference. But what if that is lacking? What if, like just as a practical example for people, we're trying spiritual life, we don't feel we have support or love. How do we get that? How do we create those kind of relationships? And how do we deal with it when it's lacking, in its absence? Because the reality is for many of us, either whether it's through a time, like we saw now during the pandemic, many people found themselves in a situation, even previously they might have had some community and support, but then suddenly they were just thrown back onto themselves. And sometimes people, for work or certain periods of life, they will again be alone and isolated. What is your advice for people in that condition? How does one deal with that? And one would say, try to make the best of the situation is not ideal.
One relationship at a time. Relationships don't magically form, or relationships are not just something that some people are lucky enough to have and other people are just unlucky. Relationships require investment, relationships require time, relationships require one to be vulnerable and open, and as we try, one relationship at a time, to actually genuinely connect with people and not just kind of superficially be acquaintances, I think that then we'll find that that love, that support, that encouragement. It's funny, I always say, I sit here talking about relationships. Like when I became a monk, relationships was the last thing I was looking for. I was like, I'm going to become a monk, and it's going to be me and God. Farewell to everyone else. And then I came into the movement, and every other class and lecture was about relationships. If you would ask me now, I would say hands down, I feel like my greatest wealth in my spiritual life is the friendships I have with other spiritual people. Because I know that everything comes from that. And it took me a long time to open up and invest in that. But one relationship at a time. And you'll find that your ability to actually connect with people expands as you form those friendships.
I had a similar experience myself, truthfully. Also having to practice, getting used to actually practicing spiritual life in isolation and making it from decision to come into a tradition in which you're confronted with the fact that relationships are essential, and it can take a long time actually to learn to again connect with people. But I appreciate your point that really it is one. We don't need to necessarily have a whole community. Well, that's the ideal. Live live in a community with like the only people that you know and love. But even just one person. Nice point. I think even one person. I'm experienced now with my mother, who's all the way in South Africa, and my father passed away not too long ago, and my sister already moved, so she's alone there. And also realizing the power of just even myself reaching out to her, just even if it's just as a relationship with me, see that difference that even an individual relationship can make. It's very, I really appreciate that point, and I think it's very practical because we might not have a big community, but we can all at least have one, like find one person listening. Now you also spoke about when you were speaking about the experience of high ideals falling short of the mark, and then explaining some of those things like guilt, depression, anxiety, the things that can come, the dark sides, the other experience, the other part of the human experience. And I think that's also something to consider when we speak about humanity and transcendence, and spirituality. And oftentimes people who have critiques of religion, spiritual traditions, oftentimes point out that how many inhumane things, at a global level, for example, has been done in the name of religion. Religious war, religious intolerance, religious hatred. Like, even if you would just go back 100 years, and you can take a cross-section throughout the globe, you can go look at most societies, and you will see that in the name of transcendence or religion, so many things were done, which is very regretful. So why is that, do you think? Why do you think that even practically, if we look at any tradition, there will be mention of high goals of love or service to God, surrender. But why is it that we see in religious traditions through history that, where does that come from? Why is it that these things happen in the name of spiritual life? That these bad things can come in and repeatedly throughout history. Why is that connection there? How do we understand that? Because on that basis, many people are arguing that the world would be better, actually, if humans would abandon transcendence, because in the name of that, so much evil has been done.
Yeah. Our teacher Bhakti, he says that religion can be practiced on 4 levels. He says the lowest level of practice is fire, when you practice some kind of religion out of fear. And then he says a little higher than that is asha, which means religion which is practiced out of a desire for something material. And then he says higher than that is kartavya, which means religion which is practiced out of a sense of duty or responsibility or gratitude. And he says higher than that is prema, or religion which is actually practiced because one is seeking and to express and experience love. And so we find most of religion in the world today is functioning on the lower drivers of that ladder. And therefore we find that often religious people do not so spiritual things. And therefore nowadays people like to also make a distinction between religion and spirituality. They say SBNR, spiritual but not religious. Because in the name of religion it can actually be just as materialistic as something non-theological. So I think it's important to understand that when we talk about religious people or religious traditions, we should understand we're really talking about a wide horizon of people who are doing things with varied motivations. And so I'm not going to sit here and try and defend religion, because I think under religion, you're right, a lot of the worst things in the world have happened. But then we could also say, if someone tries to make that point that we'd be better off without religion, then history should also show in the secular parts of the world where there was no religion, where there was no spiritual teachings, that we experienced the greatest amount of peace, community, love, and harmony between people. I guess the simple answer to that would be don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Instead of trying to do away with religion, try to find what is the essence of religion, and try to then interact with the tradition to experience that essence. And I think that's a more progressive way to go.
Yeah, that's a good point. That I think it's important for anyone who is looking for community and actually in spiritual life, it will bring us into a spiritual community, but that spiritual community is broad. And I think it's something that anyone will encounter, like experiences, not necessarily on like a maybe cosmic or like a level of war crime against humanity, but one will experience certain unpleasant experiences even within the religious community, so or a spiritual community, any community. And what did your advice be to people that come to a spiritual path for ourselves, considering good motivations, and then as we integrate sometimes into a community, whichever community that might be, we start to experience sometimes the other side of these things. How do we digest that? How do we digest the imperfections in spiritual communities without it affecting our own enthusiasm for spiritual life or being part of a community in general? Because many times people that I find, many people who have become jaded in communities in general, to the point where they don't actually want to participate, and because they just don't have any faith anymore that there is such a community that will, at the end, where the benefit will outweigh the cost.
So sometimes we're in a community and we see other practitioners who are falling short of those ideals, and it's not very inspiring, because you kind of think like, does this really work? Are these people even changing? A few things we can consider if we become discouraged by maybe other practitioners' lack of spirituality. The first thing is we can consider, instead of seeing how far they are from the ideal, perhaps we can take some time to also appreciate how far they've come from where they were. Sometimes it's easy to look at the high ideals, as you mentioned, of a tradition and measure everyone as to how much they're falling short. But what you'll also see, if you look closely in most practitioners, is that they've progressed quite a distance from where they were. And therefore that can give us the faith that even though they're not perfect, clearly there is some transformation which has occurred within them from this process. And that can also be appreciated. Another thing that's helped me is that within a community, I think you can find all types of examples. And our tendency is always to be discouraged by the bad examples, whereas we can start getting encouraged and enthused by the good examples, because there are plenty of those as well. And therefore, instead of dwelling on the negative or dwelling on what we see to be wrong, rather we can grasp and appreciate and focus and learn from what is right. And therefore I can say for myself for sure, I used to think saintly people were people of the past, people you read about in books. And then I began walking around and keeping my eyes open. And I'm convinced there are saintly people who walk amongst us today. People who are living and breathing this wisdom. And sometimes they may not have a position, they may not have a title, they may not be known to the world, but they go about their daily spirituality with incredible purity and incredible sincerity. And if we look hard enough and we look close enough with an open heart, we'll also encounter those people, and that will also reinforce our conviction that, yeah, this works. So I think there are also plenty of good examples that we can look at. And then the final thing is, I'll say that often the faults that we see in others and the imperfections that we see around ourselves, if we're introspective and reflective enough, will also be revealing as to what's going on within our own heart. The fact that we see things, the fact that we're affected by things, the fact that we allow those things to derail us from our journey, if we're humble enough, will also help us to realize that maybe a lot of that is also going on within me. The fact that it affects me so much means that there's something lacking within myself as well. And therefore, one of our teachers, he says, when faults in others misguide you, then be patient, introspect, and look for faults within yourself. Know that nobody can hurt you unless you hurt yourself. And so that ability to then use that to come back and say, what can I learn about myself from all of this going on around me?
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the principle of how I think this is an essence in spiritual life in general, that focus that has to shift from trying to change the world and then shifting that focus and trying to change the self. And seeing that a large part of that is what spiritual life connects to. And I want to sort of, I think, end off, sort of go to end with questions, but if there's a final reflection, which I think in one sense, as you said, we started with the contrast between transcendence and humanity, basically the desires. And we see that in life in general, whenever you're discussing these topics, if you ever go to philosophy, ever study philosophy, then you go to philosophy class and you think that you'll get answers. Oftentimes you see what you get is you realize that, at least when it comes to on the platform of the world and the practical reality, is that usually it's a balance. Usually we see that there's always different things that can balance out. And there's usually, what I've tried for myself is to look for a balancing factor, sort of allows us to see how these two things can be reconciled. And I was thinking, speaking, making an emphasis on purification, this idea of purification, that it's possible for us to change. It's an interesting point of how these two things come together, like humanity, like who we are, just our nature, and then this idea of these high ideals, and sort of like in between there's this principle of that, yes, there are these ideals, but as you said, at a certain point, people actually, like those ideals become what they live. That becomes their human experience. That's how they live. And it was like, if you would say to us, speak a little bit about this principle of purification in spiritual life, like this idea that one can purify our nature, and what that growth really looks like for a practitioner. What can one expect? If we make that commitment to these ideals and we have this idea, it's actually possible to inhabit them. Speaking about that process, and then also, what does that look like? The process of purification. What is the experience of a human being who then commits to this practice and starts on the go? How do we know that it's working? And what can we expect on the journey towards sacredness, which is ultimately really what spiritual life is about?
Yeah. According to psychology, there's 4 stages that we go through in transformation. The first stage is unconscious incompetence. We're doing something wrong and we don't even know it. And then they say an advancement to that is conscious incompetence. Kind of doing something wrong, but at least we can appreciate it now. And then it said that beyond that, there's conscious competence. You now forcibly, almost deliberately try to act in the right way. And then beyond that, there's unconscious competence, when it just becomes so innate, so resonant with who you are that you don't even have to think about it. And so if we look at the process of spirituality, it kind of goes through those stages. Before we came in contact with any kind of wisdom tradition, we were just living life, eat, drink, be merry, enjoy, have a good time, and you know, what's the problem? There's nothing. Life is good, and I'm doing it. And then we come to the point of conscious incompetence. We actually access a wisdom tradition, and we begin to see all of these impurities within us that previously we were completely oblivious to. One person came to me once, he said, I gotta stop coming to the temple because like I'm just becoming a worse person. And I was like, well maybe some of that was already there, but you're coming to terms with it now. Like when I came to the Hare Krishna temple, along with relationships, every other thing they talked about, every other class was about sex desire. What's up with these guys, you know? It's okay, I mean, it's there. It's not such a big thing, you know? Like, what is, you know? And then as time goes by, we actually begin to realize how deeply rooted that is within our psychology and how desensitized we've become to all of these superfluous things, material things. We don't even recognize it. So conscious incompetence. And then this whole process of Krishna consciousness, or what we call in Sanskrit sadhana bhakti, which means a deliberate spiritual practice, is then that next stage of conscious competence. We try to live by these ideals. We try to rise and practice spiritual processes, and sometimes it resonates, and a lot of the times it doesn't resonate. But conscious competence with making a deliberate, determined effort. And then gradually, it's very beautiful, as you said, as time goes by, you begin to just live this as your life. It just becomes so seamlessly integrated with who you are to live in this spiritual way. And it's so effortlessly natural that you don't even need to think about these things almost. And this incredible evolution happens. But as you can imagine, through those steps, there's a lot to contend with. There's guilt, there's feelings of hopelessness, there's a sense of will I ever make it, there's good days and bad days, there's times when you think you've changed and then the next day you're confronted again with what you thought you had given up. And there's this, so it's a long journey. And it's interesting, Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says, out of many thousands of people, one may embark on that journey. And out of those that embark on that journey, maybe a few will achieve some level of perfection. And out of those that have achieved perfection, maybe one will reach the final goal. So it's a very rare journey to go on, this journey of embracing purity in a world of degradation. But it's the greatest journey. It's the journey with it.
Thank you very much. So I think we have a few minutes. Thank you, Maharaj, for this discussion. I hope it was okay. The discussion format is a little different, but I mean, I think it was good for me. I'm happy. I have the best seat in the house. But I think we can open up and ask if there's any questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I'm so curious. You know, you could have just gone on as a monk without burning your boats, if you will, making this like lifelong decision. You could have just kind of kept the option open. So can we just talk about why you made that choice?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Many people ask that, like, why close the doors? Why just keep the options open? You know, sometimes if you imagine like this, I shine a light through this cup, but it has many holes on the side. What happens is as you close the holes, then the light achieves a certain level of focus, achieves a certain level of intensity, and when it becomes like a laser beam focus, it can penetrate through anything. And so there's a sense in life that when we kind of just close certain doors, we rule out certain things in our life, and as Hari-Vilasa was saying, we make a commitment in one direction, then that kind of commitment becomes like a laser beam, which then allows one to penetrate through anything and reach their goal. So that's what I decided to do. And I think to some extent that's what everyone is doing in their life in their own way. Like for example, Hari-Vilasa talked about marriage. And in marriage, to some extent, you're doing